Okay, to chip the model, I'll be using two different colors. For the blue areas and into the orange, basically anything that's not white, I plan to use Vallejo Off-White from the Mecha Color range. This is a fairly close match to the spaceship white that I used for the model. The reason I'm not going to use the original base color is it's Tamiya paint, and it just dries a little too fast. I don't like chipping with Tamiya paint. I'll use this, and once it's on the model, it will appear fine. The distinction won't be enough that it'll really be that visible. So this will work well. I like using the Mecha Color line for this. On the white areas, I'll be using Chipping Brown from Vallejo Mecha Color. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I've switched to this from the Ammo MIG chipping color because it's just a little thicker. The ammo stuff was just a little too watery for me. I made it work. It's not bad. I made it work, but I found that sometimes I was fighting the opacity a bit. So this heavier body to this Chipping Brown works much better. This is still airbrush ready, so it's not a thick paint. It's still a quite thin paint, but it just works better straight out of the bottle, in my opinion, for chipping. To actually apply the chips on the model, I'm going to be using pieces of sponge that I cut up. I think this is shipping foam from, if I remember right, from a fruit box someone sent to us at Christmas. But I just liked the consistency of it. It was a really large piece, so I cut up a bunch of these little squares. They're about 1/2 inch in size each. But that's what I'll be using to do the chipping. In a few areas, if I can't get down into them, I may resort to some brush chipping. But I tend to start in on the areas that are easy to get to first with the sponges, and then get into some of the harder reach areas with either a cut down sponge or some brush chipping. All right, to prepare for chipping, prepare for chipping. That was bad. Oh, well, I'm goofy. I'm gonna grab some of my, whoops, wrong color. I'm gonna grab some of my off-white. I've already given it a good shake, but I'm demonstrating a shake just to remind you to always shake your paints. But I'll be starting with the Vallejo Mecha Color Off-White, and I get a little bit into my palette, not too much. I'll add to it as I go along. And then I like to take some of these clamps like this, and I get it on my tweezer. I clamp it about halfway down into the foam so that as I'm pushing, if I push too hard, I'm not getting too much impact from this metal piece here. You can hold it with your fingers. I just find that I'm a little ham-fisted with my fingers, and this allows me to get in a little easier, a little closer. Sometimes I've seen people use a knife or some scissors to, I've heard the term hassle being used to kind of just rough up the texture of this. I've done it that way, and I've tried it without it, and to my eye, I don't see a whole lot of difference in the bigger scheme of things, so I just go with it flat like this, but you can do either way. Doesn't hurt one way or the other. I also have this piece of paper towel that I'll be using to dab the paint off on, much like dry brushing, just to offload some of the paint. And that also gives me an indication of how it's going to look on the model. So I can keep dabbing. If I want a really heavy application of chipping, then I can dab just a little bit and I'll see how it'll look on the model. If I want a lighter application, I can keep going and keep going. And again, get an indication of how it's going to look on the model, and that way I won't go in with too much. My recommendation is when you initially start working with a paint and a sponge on any given model, start lighter and then build up, because as I've said in previous videos, it's much easier to add to than take away when it comes to paint. Alright, so let's get this palette off to one side and bring the model in here and get started. I'm going to start on, sorry if I'm off camera, I'm going to start on this large blue area right here because it'll be easy to demonstrate. Now, another way that you can see this white paper towel, it's hard to see the white. So you can go in and just dab some on your thumb, but I kind of know where it's going to go, so I'm not too worried about doing that. But that's one way of seeing a little more contrast. But for this one, normally I guess you'd say I have some problems restraining my chipping. I tend to like a lot of chipping, and I often go in quite heavy and later have chipping regret. This one I'm going to try and be a little more restrained, but you know, when you do your model, you do it how you want. Now, I try to think in terms of where would the chips most likely happen. They're going to happen on the leading edges of any surface. An object coming towards the starfighter would hit and then bounce away. Now, there may be things coming in at an oblique angle that may hit, but the majority of your chipping is likely going to be on the edges and on the front-facing portions of the spaceship. So that's where I'm going to concentrate on these. But I'll continue to add here. And sometimes, if you're not getting any paint off of the sponge, move to different areas of the sponge. Now, I have to go back and reload periodically too, but there's actually a lot more paint on here than it may appear, and so I just keep working it and building up the color. And like I said, I don't want it to be too terribly heavy, although right here at the edge of this, I want it to be chipped fairly well at the edge of that paint. So that's getting to the point that I like it. Now, once the chipping with the sponge is done, of course, you can go back in with a brush and other methods to add to it, to join some of the smaller chips together, to make larger areas of paint, to make streaks and scratches that are features on the model. But that's the basic process I use for sponge chipping. So I'm going to continue around the model and work on these areas of blue, and then I'll do some of the brown and demonstrate that. Alright, I've done the chipping with the white color, and you can see how that's looking. I got the blue foot down there. I also made sure to chip on the decals, on these national markings, whatever you want to call them here, on the leading edges of these wings here. I made sure to chip it a little heavier. What I like to do is, along a leading edge like that, is to do enough chipping that right at the edge of it, white is the majority color and the blue is, there's much less of the blue. And then as it progresses back along the stripe, of course, blue becomes the dominant color and there's less white. But I want it to really look like that's worn back. And using the sponge chipping allows for a very nice effect there. Another thing to note is sometimes when you're chipping these high contrast colors, like down here, you may get a little on these darker colors. That's okay. I don't try to avoid that completely. I mean, I don't want to go in and just splatter white all over this, but I can easily go back and repaint that later just to touch it up. So if you get a little chipping out of bounds, don't worry about it. That can be touched up later. Another thing to note is that if you do get an area that's chipped too heavy for your tastes, an interesting effect can be achieved by taking the base color and going over that with sponge chipping. It should blend in fairly well with the original base, and I guess you'd say it knocks back the chipping color a bit, but it doesn't require repaint. It can give a very interesting effect. So if you get a little too much on there, try that. That can be helpful. Another method to clean up, if needed, is to get a little bit of Vallejo airbrush cleaner and a cotton bud and just gently wipe it away. Because this is gloss coated with Future, I can clean up some of the paint that I've added to the base coat without affecting the lower layers, because they're protected with the gloss coat. So there's several methods you can use if you get a little too much chipping. For the second color, I'm going to use this chipping brown. So I'll get a little on my palette here. And again, I just use a few drops at a time. You can use a wet palette for this. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it's not something I've used very often, and maybe I need to start doing so, but I've just not got the hang of using a wet palette, so that'll be a skill I need to add. I always, when I'm changing color for chipping, I always go for a new sponge. I don't just flip the old one around, so that there's not too much cross-contamination. But let me get some of the color. Let's move the palette right over here. Let me get some of the color on my sponge. And notice when I'm offloading it, I talked about earlier, you can test how it's going to look. This demonstrates it pretty well because of the high contrast. That's about what I'm going for. Now, on this chipping, on the white, I want it to be a little more restrained than, he says as he makes a giant huge chip. I want it to be a little more restrained than the white chipping on the blue, because my theory behind what's driving my chipping is that everything is a white color to start with, and then, I don't know, maybe at the factory, maybe at the squadron, they put on this blue paint. We'll pretend it's at the squadron. And maybe it's not quite as tough. Maybe the underlying material is actually some space material that's white. Whatever. The theory that I'm working on is the blue paint chips more readily than the white paint. So I want to be a little more restrained. Now, on these leading edges, again, I'll go in a little heavier than I will on the other surfaces. But we follow the same procedure. I follow the same procedure. You can too. That I did earlier with the white, and just pick some areas to chip. Don't forget the trailing edges, just to help define the edges. One of the things that chipping does, pardon my reach, is it helps define the edges of the model. So as the viewer is looking at it, it kind of enhances the shape. It makes it distinct from the background. It makes certain features stand out. So chipping is not just about making it look beat up, but it actually can draw attention to certain features, highlight the outline of a particular section of the model. So it does a lot of things. All right, I've done the chipping here in this section. A couple of things to note. Here where the mechanism, the folding mechanism is, I added some additional heavier chips. You know, thinking in terms of as this thing moves, it's going to scrape and chip and things like that. Another thing I did, sometimes on a model, I like to have an area or two on any major surface that has a really heavy streak that's attempting to tell some story in terms of what may have happened. So I went in really heavy there with the sponge, building it up to where it was just solid brown right there, and then kind of fading it back, almost as if something came along there and struck hard and then glanced off, but fragments of it went along there, and then as the edge of the wing rounds out here, as it's no longer facing the direction of whatever hit it, the streaking disappears. Now, I mentioned earlier that sometimes I'll go in and do some brush chipping, so I wanted to follow up all of this with some brush chipping. I like to use a liner brush for this. You can try, if you've never done it, you can try any brush that you like. It needs to have a fairly good point. I like the liner brush because it has a very good point, like my number 0 or number 2 round, but it doesn't hold too much paint. I don't want a lot of paint being able to flow off of the brush. I want it to be fairly controlled and restrained, because as I said, I've got trouble with restraint in chipping anyway, so I've always got to keep that in mind. So I've got a little paint in my palette here, and this is, I'm going in with this, it's unthinned, because to do this kind of chipping, I like it to be fairly thick paint when I'm adding it to the model. Now what I'll do, and pardon me if my head gets in the shot because I'm having to get in a little close here with my Optivisor, but I'll go in and I'll look for just little areas to join together, making very light brush strokes to kind of give the impression of maybe a single piece of metal from whatever hit it, or whether it's a space asteroid, or piece of a TIE fighter, or Jar Jar Binks' head floating in space. I try to join some of these together using very light strokes, working where the sponge chipping had already been, just to enhance that line, to really sell the story of something coming across right there. This is a good area if I were doing this on the blue, this would be a good area to do 2-color chipping, because you could have a really heavy area of white chipping on the blue, and then go in and join some of that together with this dark color to sell the notion that it not only chipped off the blue paint, but went right down through to whatever the base material is, the super spacey base material that this starfighter is made of. Now, it doesn't have to just be on areas like this of heavy chipping. You can decide that, okay, I want a heavier chip here, and you just kind of go in and draw those in. You want to, what I try to avoid is, I heard Lincoln Wright describe it as, ants marching across the model, just lots and lots of little dots. It can be easy to go a little too far on this technique. And I still sometimes am not happy with the result I get, but just adding in these little streaks, just barely touching the surface of the model. As I've heard Bob Ross say, I think he said 2 hairs and a little bit of air. And in some places, like there, I did 3 chips next to each other, as if something came across like that, a more solid thing. And also, now here, I shouldn't have done it this way. Now that I look at it, I wish I wouldn't have done it this way. These two are parallel. My brain always wants to make things parallel. Try to make chips that run at angles other than with the panel lines. So, you know, I really would have been better served doing this chip from this angle here. So let me just demonstrate one. And what that does is it keeps everything from being lined up with the panel lines, which is just boring. One of the ways you bring attention to a chip is by having it differ from everything else around it. Now notice that I'm not doing a solid line here. I'm kind of letting it do dots and lines that indicate something hit right there, and just streaked along like that. But by having it at a different angle than the panel lines and a different angle than the direction of travel that the streaking would indicate, it just adds a little bit of visual interest. So I'll go around the rest of the model and complete this chipping, and then the next step will be starting to add fuel and hydraulic and oil staining to all the different parts. Okay, I have the chipping done to the point that I'm happy with it on this section. I'm shooting the video just mainly on this section. I've actually got to go around and finish the chipping on the rest of the model. But in order to I've only got a limited window of time when I can video, so I'm just going to concentrate on this one section. But the next thing I want to do is I want to add in fuel and oil and hydraulic staining. So to do this, I'm going to work with 3 different products. I'm going to be using Vallejo weathering effects, petrol spills, oil stains, and fuel stains. Now the reason I've picked these, I'm not necessarily trying to replicate these particular fluids, but in terms of the color, now it may not show up here, but this is basically black, this is basically a dark brown, and this one is basically a reddish brown. So I want to get a little of each of these on my palette to work with so that I can have multiple layers of staining. So what I'll do, and I should have had this prepared ahead of time, had to reach for a brush there, sorry. But I've shaken these up, and I'm going to get a little bit of product in each of these wells here. And this is an old brush that I use for transferring paint onto the palette, and I dip it way down in there. I don't worry if it gets up into the metal part. I'm not worried about that. Why Vallejo chose this one product to not have a squirt or dropper bottle, I don't know. Because I know they have the lids right here. Why this one is this way, I don't know. But I'll get this one in, and then I know it may be a little odd showing how I put product in the palette, but I wanted to demonstrate my method for this. I'm cleaning the brush off camera. I'll put the next color over here, and I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. This allows me to mix these two between and have, because I'm using 3 different colors, I'll actually have the option of choosing from 5 different colors if I want to. I may not. It just depends on my mood as I go along. I do plan when I'm working what I want to do, but I kind of go into it with, well, here's the outcome I think I want, and then I tend to charge into it, and I may make adjustments along the way. So it may be a little bit of a loosey-goosey approach, and maybe I'd be better off if I planned a little more, but so far it's worked for me, so I'm going to stick to it. Okay, the brush I'm going to be using to apply this is a number 2 round brush. Unlike the chipping, I like to have, for the chipping I wanted to use a liner brush which would load up less paint. For these oil stains, I like to have a little more paint in the brush, so that's why I go with the number 2. Now this is not a fancy one, this is just one that I picked up at the art store. It's synthetic, it's nothing special, but it's actually held its tip quite nicely over the last few models that I've built, so I'm real happy with it. But what I'll do, and pardon the reach across the camera, is I'll start in the area that I'm looking at, that I'm working on, and I'll just pick an area and say, well, there's some pipes and other things there. So I'm going to go in initially with just straight on heavy oil staining inside that panel. I'd already put some earlier, but that was more to define the area, to make the detail pop out. This application is to deliberately get it looking grimy and dirty, because if you've ever seen any, it's not just military equipment, real life equipment that's used a lot, hydraulic things burst, dirt and grit and all sorts of things accumulate, so it can make quite a mess in an area like that. And then what I'll do is I'll just begin imagining some streaking, some staining, and just lightly, I guess you'd say, just lightly draw it in. And I just do it how it looks good to me. Sometimes I may streak it in like that. Sometimes I may dab in bits like that, because I want to not only simulate if a fluid leak happened while in flight, and thus it would move, the airflow would move things back. Now I know it's in space, but you know, in space no one hears you scream, and they also don't hear you complain about accuracy. So I know there's no air in space, but we'll pretend that at some point it flew through the atmosphere and it had a leak and these stains happened. But then there's others that can happen where things explode and they splatter, or it's sitting on the ground and it's got an oil leak. I mean, if you've ever looked under your car, you know you may have different leaks that happen under there also. So I try to simulate those kind of streaks and grime along this area here. And I'll even put some in on the pipe work right there. And then what I do, without letting anything really dry, I clean off the previous color from my brush, give it a good lick to get the point back. They need to put taste in these paints. so us brush lickers get a little reward for licking the brush. But then I'll just simply go in and add some more stains using a different color. This layering effect really, in my mind, brings it to life. It's very subtle between these two colors, but it is visible, and I think it makes a big difference in the final finish of the model. Okay, another area, another method that I like to add staining is imagining grease spots that are just discolorations along the general surface, not necessarily around these open areas, but maybe something near some of this pipe work, or just that's right here on the surface of a panel. Maybe when it was being worked on, you know, Private Snuffy had this panel on the ground and he spilled some oil on it, and so it's on there, but you know, they've got to go fight space battles against the TIE fighters, so they don't have time to clean it up. What I'll do there is I'll dip my brush in some water and I'll just get a little puddle of it like that. And then I'll pick up some of one of the staining products. And so I have a highly thinned version of it. And I offload quite a bit of it. And I simply go in and I paint a shape. Just a random shape like that. And all I'm doing is I'm dabbing the brush. I'm not actually painting like you normally would if you're going to be painting it for adding color. You know, if I'm painting this blue or something. I'm just kind of dabbing around and letting my eye decide what's right. You know, when you're building your model, when you're weathering it, when you're staining it, you get to decide what's right. If you like the way something looks, then do it. Now I can go in and dab it off with my finger just like that, a quick stab in and back out. And now I don't know if that shows right there on camera very well, but it gives it just a nice little subtle stain. And the more you thin it, the more subtle the stain is. So I'll add a few of these in and get some nice staining effects. What you can also do, what I like to do, is I like to get a second color introduced. I'll make another little puddle of water and I'll grab some of this lighter color here. And a really neat effect can be achieved by going in where you previously put a stain and just notice, I don't know if you can see, there's a little drop of paint right there on the metal part. I have to watch that. Sometimes it'll sneak off the brush and ruin your day. But going in kind of around the other stain, but maybe overlapping a bit, not covering it up, but adding multiple colors to the stain can really help sell it. It gives it a depth that using a single color might not do. I'm going to introduce a third one here. Let me offload the brush. And I'll just go in. That was so subtle you couldn't even see it. Sometimes you have to be careful with subtlety because you can over subtle it. I do that a lot. I'll sit here and work on something and get done and look at it 20 minutes later and realize you can't see anything I did, that I kind of out subtled myself. But this area, once it dries, and I don't know how well this is going to show, but once it dries, that's going to have 3 different colors of stains, and I think it gives a really nice effect to the model, to sell that there's something going on there, that there's different types of fluid. When it's combined with the chipping around it, I think it really brings out, it brings the model to life. And it's just as simple as dabbing on color. Now, of course, as you do this, you know, the first time you do it, it may look a little contrived. You may not like the way it looks. There's times now that, though I've done this a lot, there's times that I get done with a section and I'm like, that's not really what I was going for. But as you do it, you learn how the various products that you're using will interact and what result they'll leave, and it gives you the ability to kind of control that the more experience you have in it. And this same type of method, although I'm using acrylics here, this same type of method would work with oils and enamels. The big difference would be you'd have to be a little more careful with oils and enamels, that when you put on one color, that adding another color if there was a lot of thinners involved, that it didn't activate the previous layer. That's one of the things I like about using acrylics, is I can go in and make some stains like this, and let's put some on the blue there. Yeah, don't forget the other colors. I can go in and put some stains here, and in a few minutes this will be dry enough to put on more of the staining stuff, the staining fluids, and not have it activate the layer underneath. There's a place where I'm just dabbing it just to get some randomness. If you dab it like that, shouldn't leave a thumbprint, fingerprint. It should just give you some staining. See, this one is starting to dry out. These two areas here and here are starting to dry up, and I'm really liking that. That's exactly what I wanted to happen. That's the kind of stain I wanted to see. I think it looks pretty cool. So, and also as you're working with these products, take note as you're applying them, especially the first few times you're applying them. Take note of how they go on wet and then how they dry, because that will help you when you're putting them on, that they do look different when you put them on than when they dry. So knowing that difference and how it's going to end up will help you be in control of the technique, rather than, as I've mentioned before, rather than the technique being in control of you. Another note, there is some benefit sometimes to letting an area partially dry, so that there's, like here, this forward part of it was dry, but the back part of it was still wet. I can go in with another color and it will intermingle the two, and that intermingling will provide a kind of a transition color between them, so it can add additional effects to it. Okay, I've added in more stains, more grime to this area. Once I'm finished with staining the entire model, I'll go back and do some adjustment on streaks and chipping, just to get it all balanced out, to give it a good unified look. And those stages will then be complete. The next step in the process will be to pull out the old airbrush and add some additional streaks and stains to the model with that, and give it a little more life, hopefully. Okay, I'm going to start off the next steps with some airbrushing. What I've got here is a mix of 2 parts XF69 NATO Black from Tamiya and 1 part XF9 Whole Red. What I did was I just had a bottle of Whole Red that was almost empty, and years ago I started using this as my mixing bottle, and whenever it gets a little low, I pour in basically 2 parts of the NATO Black, 1 part of the Whole Red, and I don't thin it when I pour it into this bottle. I do that in the airbrush before I use it. But what this color is good for is exhaust stains, post shading of panel lines. It can double as grime and dirt and all sorts of things. It's a really, really nice color. I typically thin this with just plain old rubbing alcohol, 91% alcohol. Using alcohol as a thinner for Tamiya, it works fine. I don't use it for general paint coverage because it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of adhesion. The X28 thinner has much better adhesion. Mr. Color Leveling thinner also has very good adhesion. For Tamiya paints, thinning with alcohol, for post shading, for gradient effects, things like that, non-base coat stuff, it works really well because, one, it's cheap. That's part of the reason I use it. but because it evaporates so quickly as it's hitting the model, you really can get right down into it and give it a fairly heavy application, but you don't have to worry too much about it flooding the model. You do have to be careful. If you stay too much in one area, it will do it. You'll get spiders flying around the surface of it, but this works really well. All right, my airbrush that I'll be using today is a Badger Patriot Extreme Patriot 105. Several reasons I'm using this one. One, it's got a 0.3 nozzle, so it allows me to get finer lines for the post shading and the other effects that I'm going to be working on. But primary reason is it has this little adjustment nozzle that allows me to very finely dial in the air pressure. I could do it over on the compressor, you know, and try and take it from 20 psi to 18 to 15 to 12 to whatever. But that can be such a hit or miss process, and quite frankly, because of where the air compressor is sitting when I normally airbrush, I can't see the pressure gauge very well, and I have to pick it up and look really close and then adjust it while it's on. It's a big pain. By having the little adjustment nozzle or an adjustment screw right here, I can do it very quickly and easily on the airbrush. The hardest part of using it is to remember, you know, normally I remember the way I use a screw is righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. But when you're looking down, I have to remember that it's the opposite. So sometimes I'll think I'm tightening it up and I'll unscrew it and the thing will drop out. So if that happens today, you'll know why. All right, the plan of attack is to add post shading in some areas consistently across the model, such as these major divisions here between this section and this section. I definitely want some shading there. You'll remember I built this by painting it first, then putting it together, which meant I did not do any panel line work. I didn't do any seam filling or anything like that. I went on, you know, trusting Bandai's fit and that I could make any of the panel lines, any of the seams appear as panel lines. So a few places, such as along the front of this section here, which I chipped to kind of disguise that a little bit. I'm going to post shade that. The idea is I'm going to try and make it look as if it's a panel line, that it's supposed to be there. Other areas, such as the transition between the white and the blue, I'm going to do some there. These major sections, I'll do a little bit along some of the panel lines. Probably not all of them, well, not probably, not all of them. And then I'll introduce, using the airbrush, some additional streaking. In some areas where there are streaks that are supposed to represent fuel leaks and things like that, the airbrush is a great way to enhance those. By having the air pressure low, using the 0.3 nozzle, and with the paint thinned very well, it can allow you to get some really fine lines. So I'll be using it in those areas. I'm not going to demonstrate doing it on the entire model. Neither one of us want that to happen. But I'll do some of these areas just to demonstrate the process, and then I'll go and finish it all off camera. All right, to start off, I'm going to put the paint in my color cup, and I wanted to demonstrate this, to talk about it just for a few minutes. I've read so many people say, don't mix your paint in the color cup, don't mix your paint in the color cup. In general, I say yeah, because if you're doing it for base coverage, you may want to get it thoroughly mixed in a cup external to the color cup before you put it in there. Certainly if you're mixing paint, you want to do that. But a lot of times for general, just for effects like this, I go ahead and mix it in the color cup. And the rule of thumb I try to tell people that are worried about, you know, that they're breaking some kind of international law or that it's going to hurt the airbrush or something is use your logic and your experience. Over time, those should dictate what will work in terms of mixing in the cup and what won't. If you try mixing it in the cup and it doesn't do whatever you need to do, you'll know next time that's not a circumstance in which I'll mix it in the cup. But other times it works just fine. I always, when I mix it in the cup, I always put the thinner in first. And I like to use a brush, and I'll show you why. Now, for this type of effect, I fill the color cup up about 3/4, that's maybe 2/3, roughly like that with the alcohol. I get just a bit of paint on the end of my brush, not a lot, and I go in stirring. The reason I do that is if I just set it in there and let it all fall off the brush and sink to the bottom, it'll blob down in the bottom of the color cup, and I'll get a big thick blob of paint down in there. But by going in stirring, I mix it in there fairly thoroughly. And then I just clean it off like that. And you can see that is thin. It's little beyond ink at this point. I don't know the exact ratio you'd say this is in there, but it's very thin, but it's going to allow me to get some really nice effects. And the last step, especially when you're using paint this thin, cover that puppy up, because I learned one time I tilted the airbrush over when I was using it, and I went really almost vertical with it to try and get something and forgot to put the lid on and spilled every bit of that over the wing of a model. And that results in more than a few paratrooper words. So be aware of that whenever you're mixing a paint like this. All right, now that I've got everything prepared, I'm going to start work on airbrushing the model. You'll hear my compressor going on and off in the background. Not much I can do about that. So what I do is I start by just getting the paint generally flowing like that. And I just want to see the color coming through. There we go. Now, what I'll do is I've got to check which direction I need to be screwing this nozzle in. So let me look at it, go that way. Okay. I do this by sound. And I'm listening for a particular sound. It's probably not quite audible, but I want to get it screwed in to where I'm getting just a very particular airflow that allows me to do really fine. I mean, look at the line you can get there. That's good right there. And that also tells me if I need to thin my paint in the cup more. Sometimes if I get too much paint in the cup and adding more of the alcohol isn't possible, I'll actually dump it out and start over. Over time, you kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. Now, going into the model, let me put this down here just so I don't spray onto my cardboard. I use this gray cardboard. I also use it as a photographic backing. So I don't want to mess that up too bad. I'm going to go in here on the paper towel, get my paint flow going, and then just begin spraying. Now, I start off further away from the model so that I can kind of see how the color is flowing to build in a shadow. And here I want a fairly heavy shadow. You see how that built it up? I want it looking smoky. I want it looking dirty. You know, it's a little grungier right there, like it's been sitting in a cigarette bar on a shelf for 20 years. Hand me another cigarette, dearie. Anyway, so that's the process I'm going to be going through, and I just continue doing this all across the model. And I apologize for my hands being in the way. I don't know that there's any other way of doing this, because I like to hold the model, because at times I'll twist both the airbrush and the model. And you see it's just adding in some color there. Normally I would get in a little closer and look at this with my Optivisor. Because of the camera being right there, I can't get in as close, so I'm gonna sacrifice a little bit of what I can normally do for the sake of demonstration. On the rest of the model I'll be able to do it a little finer. But I'll go into the blue area here and add that in. I call this blue area the foot. I don't know why. I really do wonder, in the developer's mind, or the designer's mind, what this section was supposed to be used for, because it almost looks like refueling probes. It doesn't look like weapons. The weapons are here, and so I wonder what this was supposed to be. But you see here, I gave that line, which gives it a little more depth, makes it look nice. I think it makes it look nice. Now along this leading edge here, I'll do the same process. I'll just essentially dirty it up a bit, which my hope is that it will sell this crack, because somebody's going to look at this. I mean, I can guarantee you when I put up photos of this, somebody's going to look at that and say, "You forgot to close that gap." And I'm going to say, no, I didn't forget to close it. I deliberately wanted this to be a low pressure, low key build where I wasn't having to do a lot of masking and a lot of crazy stuff to close off these lines. And so I'm going to pretend in my brain that it's a panel line. There. You still see it. I wasn't trying to make it so that you couldn't see it. The point is, I'm trying to sell it as something that it's not. We'll see. To be honest, a lot of my build work, the two questions I always try to satisfy are, will it photograph well, and will it sell? Because I could take the time to do this the way most modelers do and seal that up, but I wouldn't be able to get out 3 articles a week. So I have to make a few sacrifices now and then. And I think when you're building, you can have goals. You know, you can say, I'm just gonna put this one together. I'm not gonna sweat those little details. Whereas another time you may want to really sweat the little details. It's whatever's going to make it fun for you. All right, now let me add in a few stains here. Like right here, I've already started some fuel streaks with some of the bottled products that I use, some of the Vallejo weathering products. So I'm going to go in now and I'm going to just enhance those a little bit. And I'm going to just paint right over them. Because the paint is so translucent, it retains that dark look. But then aft of it, it adds in a little more depth. And so this helps build up what I talked about earlier, I think in the video, a depth of finish. And I'm going to just do a little more streaking. I'm going to put some right here. We're going to pretend there's just some kind of stain coming out right there. Like that. And I'll go through and do this over the rest of the model. You can do kind of almost laser blast damage like this, just making little shapes like something's hit. Almost like a little starfish like that. And just give it some kind of damage like that. It just looks like something's hit it. and you can sell it that way. So I'm going to go around and continue working on the model, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. And this guy is just about finished. One of the last steps I'll need to do is to pop on the canopy, which I've waited until now to get done. Say goodbye to Fast Eddie there, and I'll get this popped in. Doing it on camera, so I'm hoping it works. And there it goes. That's Bandai Fit for you right there. Little click here and there, and it is on. I don't even have to glue it. Now, the last step, well, okay, the next to last step. The next to last step is I'm just going to go and look around the model and see if there's anything I want to adjust. Adding a little more streaking here or there, adding any oil stains, touching up any paint, just kind of a final, I guess you'd say, quality control check. And I don't make a big deal of it. You know, I'm kind of loosey-goosey in my modeling. As I say, you know, it's about fun. If there's something that I think I could do a little better, then I'll do it. If there's stuff that I look at that I realize, I should have done better on that early on, but it would take too much to correct now, I just move on, because I've got 12 other models that I'm working on. So it's not like there's not going to be another model coming along soon. But I'll do that final quality control check, just looking for anything I want to adjust. Then I'll put on a matte coat. I use Vallejo's Mecha Color matte varnish to flatten everything down, and I'll give it a coat of that. I'll pull off the canopy masking, and this guy will be done. I'll get him up on the base and show you what that looks like when it's all finished. All right, and with that matte coat applied, I am calling the Bandai 1/72 scale B-Wing Fighter finished. It's obviously a little awkward to film in this final state sitting up on its stand, but I felt like this was the only way to really see it, how it looked in its final form. I'll reach in here and turn around. I don't have a cool little carousel thing like a lot of guys who film their videos do, but you can kind of see how it looks. It's a little, the base wobbles a little bit, but it's actually fairly solid for display. I'm not worried about whoever eventually buys this having to worry about it falling off the base or anything like that. It's very stable. It's a very fun kit to build. If I had, I mean, the only drawback to the kit, and it's not the kit, it's not Bandai, it's just such a weird configuration, a weird layout, that holding it and weathering it and displaying it are just a bit odd. But that's completely out of Bandai's control. I had to blame George Lucas for that. But it's a lot of fun, and to my eye, it looks like the starfighter in the movie, and I love the colors. I wasn't sure how I felt when I first started building this about those orange spots. I'd never noticed those in the movie. I only noticed them once I started looking at the model, and I wasn't sure how I felt about them, but I actually like them at this point. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I apologize that this video had to be split into two, and it's still a fairly long one. But thank you for hanging in there and watching this. And more importantly, thank you so much for being a Patreon supporter. It really, really helps us out in allowing me to keep building, to keep going at the pace that I do. I've said it before, that were it not for this support, I just simply wouldn't be able to do the things that I'm doing. We couldn't afford for me to keep up the pace that I was at. And so I am most grateful, my family and I. If you do want to share a link to this video, I would ask that you share the link to the Patreon page that this is on, not the Facebook or YouTube link, because this is supposed to be exclusive for patron supporters. So please keep that in mind. And I hope you've enjoyed this process. I certainly have. It's been interesting. This is the first of the Patreon exclusive build videos that I've done that I've finished the series. So this is kind of a milestone for me. I've learned a lot in terms of what to do and what not to do with video. So hopefully that'll mean some better videos in the future. But thank you for watching this. Thank you for being a supporter. And look for photos on the blog. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.